In this video, we're going to continue our quest for the form of the people of God. We're going to look at what Loafing calls the definitive form of the people of God, the people of God as a federation of synagogues. Here's the Herva synagogue in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, of course, the capital of Judah, the homeland of the Jewish people. So synagogues have been in Jerusalem, not quite since the beginning of synagogues, as we'll see, but synagogues have been in Jerusalem for a long time, since the Jews were freed from the Babylonian exile in 515 BC. Here's the Jubilee Synagogue, also known as the Jerusalem Synagogue in Prague. There have been Jewish communities in Prague since the 10th century. So there have been Jewish synagogues in Prague for that long as well. Here's a Jewish synagogue, the Synagogue THEO in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. This is a Bukharan Jewish community that gathers at this synagogue today. The community is really rooted in Bukhara, which is another city in modern-day Uzbekistan. But the Jews in Bukhara trace their history back to the early days of the Babylonian exile. So this community, this synagogue community, may be as old as some of the Jerusalem synagogue communities. So if you remember the way that the Babylonian exile worked, the Babylonians exiled many of the Jews from Judah, and they resettled them all over the Babylonian exile, Babylonian Empire. Later, under Persian and Greek and even Roman rule, Jews continue to flourish all over the Near East and Central Asia. As well as Northern Africa and Southern Europe. Here's a Jewish synagogue, contemporary Jewish synagogue, the Temple Beth Shalom. This one is in my hometown of Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. You see they have erected a booth there for the Feast of Booths, I assume. This is a festival practiced by Jews still today where they build a booth to live outside to commemorate the time that God provided for them in their journey from Egypt to the Promised Land after the Exodus, when God freed them from slavery. Remember, this is also the time when God gave them the Torah. So not only were they freed from slavery in Egypt, through the Torah, through following the Torah and living the Torah, they would also be free from enslaving one another and the immigrants who came to live in their communities. So the Feast of Booths is a commemoration of this, as well as thanking God for providing them with the fruits of the harvest every year. So again, Loefing calls this the definitive form. So this is what he thinks is the best form or expression of the people of God, the best way for them to organize. All right. So he's making a commentary here, not just about this period historically in the Jewish history of the Jewish narrative, but also he's making comments about the way that the church would, in his opinion, best function today. And he makes some very good arguments for this kind of model. So when does the synagogue, the Federation of Synagogues, start? Well, it starts with the exile. So realize what happened before the exile. You had that the church as the nation state, right? You had a king. First with David with the United Kingdom, and then soon after David, you had a divided kingdom, but you still had the kingdom of Judah with its capital city Jerusalem up until 587 BC when the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem and sent the Jews into exile in Babylon. So during that Babylonian exile period, and then the period afterwards, even after the Persians defeat the Babylonians and allow the Jews, actually encourage the Jews to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Most Jews did not go back. Most Jews stayed in the diaspora. So you had these Jewish communities living in diaspora. All right, so what did it look like in exile and diaspora? Well, in order to maintain their identity while living in exile, remember that the Jews enclaved. That means they started living together, right? They would form their own small communities and neighborhoods all over the Babylonian and later Persian, Greek, and Roman empires. They would marry within the Jewish community to maintain their ethnic identity, right? And most importantly, they got serious about forming and following the Torah. Really, many scholars say that Judaism is actually born in the exile period and post-exile or diaspora period. So this is when we have that kind of overlap, right? Because we have the temple period still going on, right? From 515 BC, when the Jews were allowed to go back to Jerusalem, actually encouraged to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. So during this time period, you already had these synagogues or these communities of worship and Torah study that were forming in the exile. So in many ways, the synagogue model, the synagogue form of the people of God predates the temple community, right? Because the temple community started when the Jews went back and rebuilt the temple. But for that 50 years that they were in exile, the synagogues had already started up, right? Jews were already coming together in these houses of worship, and we'll see they're more than that, right? In these community centers, we could call them. We call them centers of Jewish life, right? Probably the best term. They came together to meet in these places. They gathered together and reminded each other, right, what it meant to be Jewish. And that's really where the Torah comes out of. Remember that the P writers, right, are writing during this period, and you can see their response from their creation stories and their foundational stories are as a way to in certain aspects to distinguish themselves from the dominant cultures. A way to show their children an alternative to the Babylonian worldview. So this was the time that the synagogues started. You would have Jews coming together, meeting together, enclaving, forming their own communities, forming and getting very serious about following the Torah, right? kind of separating themselves for the sake of to maintain their identity within the larger society of Babylon. And that's there where the synagogues start. Now, again, once they go back 515 BC and rebuild the temple, now you have that temple community, right? That temple Torah community that we talked about in the previous section. But coexisting along with that, all over the known world, are these synagogue communities, right? In these various Babylonian and then Persian and then Greek and then Roman cities. So there is that overlap. Now, what happens in 70 AD? The Romans destroy the temple. So now there's no more temple. The temple community is gone. But what remains? Torah and synagogue. Right? Those are the key elements of Jewish life. So the synagogue is the place where the Jews gather and practice the Torah life, where they gather and pray the Torah life, where they gather and study the Torah life. This becomes the primary model of Judaism, the primary form of the people of God from the time of the destruction of the temple onwards, right? But remember, it existed even before. It existed in its rudimentary form even before the temple was rebuilt. So Lofian goes on to talk again, as he did in the last section, about the Torah as the real exodus, the Torah as the real freedom from the oppression of the pagan societies that Israel constantly was being freed from. Right? He calls it the portable fatherland of the Jews. Right? Because the Torah gave the Jews a way to be Jewish no matter where they lived. Right? If they followed the Torah, and if they had their own communities within a larger society, then they could still, in a certain way, live in Israel, right? Because they're still living by the will of God, right? Or at least their ears are open to it. At least they are still acknowledging it and trying to follow it. So the synagogue is a house of Torah-centered prayer, right? Once the Torah is formed, it is the foundation of the whole synagogue movement. But it's also a house of Torah study. It's also a place where the Torah is housed. It's also a place where people would go to read the Torah. It's also where the rabbis, who are the scholars of the Torah, right? It's where they're going to do a lot of their study. It's more than that, though. The synagogue has more than that. Lofian calls it a community center, right? It's a place where the whole of life is lived according to the Torah. So we'll see festivals there. We'll see worship there, right? We'll see community events there, right? We'll see people gathering there for just for social purposes. Okay, I say just, but again, it's social purposes in the Torah life, right? The Torah is going to shape everything within the synagogue. Because it's those very synagogue communities, again, that were the ones who formed the Torah in the first place. So we see the similar balance between, the formation of the New Testament and the life of the church today. That same balance, right, where the people of God formed the holy text, right, the Torah or the New Testament in our case. But then that text is going to shape the people of God. It gives them something to center around, something to come back to, something to check themselves, right? So they can see that they are staying true to the will of God, right? And they can check themselves. We can check ourselves to see, are we really being the people of God? Or have we substituted our own selfish desires for God's will of unconditional and universal love. So these synagogues survived and they were tolerated in the Greek and Roman empires. They were tolerated during these times as a kind of club. Various clubs that gathered together for various reasons um, were very common. There was these kind of social clubs that existed all over the Greek world, and they would come together, and they would have their own space in which the members would engage in the activities that they were focused around. So this is the way that the larger society in the Greek and Roman times viewed the synagogues. But the synagogues were more than the Greek clubs. The synagogues were, as Loefing puts it, an association of communities, right? Each one of them was like a tiny commonwealth. He doesn't use the word nation, right? Because they didn't operate as a nation state, but they were their own society, right? So it wasn't like just members of the larger society had a special interest, like in the Greco-Roman clubs, but it was actually a separate society, a distinct society existing within the larger state society. Make sense? So they were like little islands of Judah within Babylon, little islands of Judah within the Persian Empire, little islands of Judah within the Greek states, little islands of Judah within the Roman Empire. So you see there are these communities, but again, they're not a nation state. Why? Because everything's voluntary, right? Understand, when you have a state, you have an enforced way of life, right? I mean, look at our states, right? The United States of America. You have to pay taxes under penalty of law. You have to follow laws under penalties of various degrees, right? You have to do these things. You don't have a choice. That's force. This is the way that governments are inherently violent. You must do what they say, or there will be penalties, including imprisonment, right? Which you will be forced to go there, right? If you get, we've probably all had the unfortunate occasion to see someone handcuffed by the police, right? What is that? That's a form of violence, right? The state is going to force you to do it. That is an aspect of the state, right? That there is forced compliance with the ideals or laws of the state. The Torah communities, right? The synagogue communities, it's voluntary, right? It was voluntary association with the Torah, with these communities. People chose, right? There was no state enforcement. The Jews in these communities chose to live as part of them, right? They had constant communication with each other all over the world. So they were unified, right? In the way that a country with colonial lands might be, a country with satellite countries or something like that. But again, they're not a state because it's voluntary. There's no forced participation. And they all have these ties, right, to Israel and Jerusalem. So again, you're seeing kind of a people, right, individual commonwealths, right, joined together, even though they're spread out geographically. Like I say, little islands of Judah, little islands of the voluntary, right, confederation of the Torah communities. Not Judah as a nation state, but Judah as something more akin to the early Confederacy days. Judah as a voluntary society. So again, here's where on page 118 is where Lofink says this is the way it was for the early church too, right? You had a network of people existing in their own communities, their enclave communities, voluntarily, people joining the church. We learned in the early days of the church, people selling what they have, putting everything in common. But not by some forced action of the state. No, by their own choice, right? And you had these various communities in the Greek cities all over the known world, right? So it exists within a larger society. Within a state, you have a society or a people that is not a state. It's a voluntary society. It's one in which you can freely join and freely drop out. It's a true homeland. It's a true people. It's a true society, united, right? Even though they are dispersed in their various communities all over the known world. But not a state. And Lofink makes a comment here, right? He says the church, the Christian church, the statehood period of the Middle Ages and earlier was disastrous. He said it was a detour. He really sees the state model in which people are somehow compelled or forced to participate in the people of God as antithetical to what it means to be the people of God, right? You can't force people to be free, and the community of God is free. You can't force people to love, right? The community of God is that community of loving persons. You can't force people to trust, right? And that's what the community of God is all about, trusting God, therefore trusting each other. You can't make people do it. It has to be a choice. Because the transformation of the human heart and therefore the transformation of the human society, it can only happen in freedom. And so we see for Lofink the definitive form of the church, the definitive form of the people of God, and therefore the definitive form of Israel, and its tribe Judah in this case, is a free association of voluntary communities, right, which exist within a dominant state. To try to take this community of free and loving persons and force it on people through kind of state Christianity or state Judaism was a detour, right? That was going in the wrong direction, according to Lofink, right? We see similar thoughts in some of the recent Star Wars movies, right? Where Anakin Skywalker kind of starts to go to the dark side under this premise, right? He says, oh, I can force people, I can force peace, freedom, justice, and security. Of course, that one's worked in, right? Remember, security was the reason that Israel took this detour into a nation state when they said they wanted a king, right, to protect them from the Philistines. We hear a lot of social commentary today about if various elements in our society are playing up our security needs in a way that is detrimental to our freedom. It's a classic debate and dialectic for all free societies. You have to balance security and freedom. But I digress. Loafing's point here is that you cannot force the freedom. Therefore, a state sponsored church or a state endorsed church is going to, on some level, compel people to join the people of God, which just can't happen because you cannot create that free and just society with force. You can't force people to be free. You can't force them to love one another. So in the final section here in this chapter, Loafink makes reference to the Babylonian Talmud. This is Jewish commentary on the Torah. And he has a discussion between three rabbis. And the first says that the world was created solely for David's sake. So that means that in prayer, right? Because David composed the Psalms. He's the traditional author of the Psalms. That in prayer, the world, the meaning of the world, the reason for creation is fulfilled. And then the next rabbi says it's from Moses, right? So Moses, of course, wrote the Torah, right? He's the traditional author of the Torah. So the Torah, remember, is the teachings about how to live in a free, just, and loving society. So in the teachings of the free, just, and loving society, the meaning of the world, the meaning of the creation of the universe is made clear. Then there's something else to add. Another rabbi, the Rabbi Johanan, says, for the sake of the Messiah, right? And so Loafink makes this final point. He says that the Psalms and the Torah, right, the prayer and the free society, the teaching for the free society, yes, those both express the meaning of the creation. But for the fullness of it, right, it's not enough just to have prayer, right, that personal sense or even communal sense of union with God. It's not just enough to have the teachings about how to treat one another and love each other in a just and free society, right? In order for the people of God to come about in fullness, right, what we will call in Christianity the kingdom of heaven or the reign of God, Loafing points out that you need the Messiah, right? You need God to come among us and transform us so that we don't just have the teachings about the just and free society. We don't just have the moments where we understand God's will, right? In this communion with God in the spiritual sense. But through the transformation that we actually become a society in which we love others like God loves us. That we actually become a mirror of the Trinity, right? An expression of the Trinity, right? A community of loving persons. For that, we're not just going to accomplish it by talk and study. God joins with us. He makes us part of his family, right? He shares with us his divine nature so that we can share in the divine life, not just in the afterlife, but here on earth, right? Through becoming the new Jerusalem, for actually living out the meaning of the Torah, right? And a whole life that is prayer, a whole life that is an expression of God's love, in a way that we care and love for one another. And the actualization, not just the teaching, but the actualization of the free, just, and loving community.